Okay, adventures wanted. Boblin, this could be it. In connection with the death of Boblin, we gotta go. Hi folks, welcome to Glitter Void Gamecraft. My name is Eric, and this week we're working on a notice board. A small decorative piece of scatter terrain that can really go anywhere in town. The road leading into the main area, the town square, which is what I'm making this a part of, outside of the tavern, anywhere where adventurers or other kinds of people would see this sort of thing. After all, can you even really call yourself an adventurer if you haven't been on at least one quest to destroy an old piece of jewelry? Your quest, should ye be so bold as to accept it, is to come with me and let's get crafting. I started research for this piece by looking online, trying to see something that might inspire a new sort of take on this, but I was actually pretty disappointed. A lot of two-posts, beam between them, maybe some sort of shelter, just nothing that really struck me. What finally sparked some thoughts in my head was actually seeing a modern informational kiosk of some kind. The sort of thing that has bus schedules and points of interests on multiple sides. So I thought I'd make a fantasy version of this. I wasn't going to put this on some sort of base, maybe some kind of dirt or built up material around the edges to give it a wider base, as well as leave the bottom universal enough that I could put this anywhere. Definitely poorly constructed, definitely ramshackle. Adventuring is a last-ditch kind of effort, not a glorious future. I went through my scrap pile and found some pretty good corner post pieces that were made out of XPS foam. Using a miniature to get an idea of how tall these would need to be, I just kind of started putting together some basics for the height of the poles and the size of the actual place where you stick posters. I landed on a board side of 1 inch by 2 inches and approximately half an inch up off the ground. Wanted to make sure the gnomes and halflings could read stuff too. This is an egalitarian fantasy society. With the exception of the corner posts and the shingles later, everything of this would be made out of dollar store foam core, the kind where the paper tears off very easily. I created the wooden plank and the wood grain textures using the lead of a mechanical pencil. I did this on both sides and all the top and bottom edges because I wasn't quite sure how open this would be or how visible the inside would be. When you're making something where it would be obvious if the plank textures didn't line up, what I like to do is to finish the plank lines on the top and bottom pieces and then use that as a guide to connect them rather than measuring them, because that would end up looking probably a little bit too machine made. I created sort of a bottom border piece with some more scrap pieces. I don't really know what purpose this serves other than to just have some wood where the grain texture isn't running vertically. Since this was feeling like it was going to be rather flimsy, I decided to try to stake in some of the pieces using the tips of toothpicks. This is something that I honestly don't do that much, mostly because I have problems getting it to work. My foam seems to just kind of get compressed rather than pierced, and it ends up pushing the pieces apart rather than holding them together. In trying to attach them with tacky glue and then do the same thing with a spike for the bottom border piece, it just ended up being a little more trouble than it was worth. So after ripping out all of the spikes, I just went back to tacky glue and pinning everything, making sure that the pins themselves were hidden in the wood grain texture. Once the first side of the triangle was complete, now it was time for the tricky part. Without the strength of the toothpicks, I definitely needed to make sure that the connections between the boards and the posts was as firm as possible. So I sliced the ends of each board at an angle to create a flat surface for it to bond to the posts. This was not a perfect equilateral triangle. It took a couple tries to get the sides of each board to be flat enough. Needless to say, this whole mess was held together with about 1,000 pins. By the time the tacky glue had a chance to dry, I knew what I wanted to do with the roof, which meant that the inside was going to be more covered up. So I went in with my hot glue gun and just glorped in a bunch of glue on all of the seams, since that would be hidden. This would, of course, add more strength as well as just a little bit of weight to keep this thing from being totally top-heavy. If you thought I was unsure about what I was doing for the base, you're going to love me working on the roof. The super ramshackle nature of this meant that the substructure of the roof was going to show through, so I actually had to build something that kind of made sense. It's hard for me to comprehend how you build a roof on an actual equilateral triangle, let alone on my oblonged monstrosity. I kind of just started gluing pieces together to create the cap. Once I had a basic frame together, I started to work on the actual surfaces that the shingles would be attached to, just using more cutoffs. Once the first few boards were attached, I just let the boards run long and used the edge of the roof itself as a jig to trim off any of the excess. Say what you want about this roof, but it certainly is a shape. For the shingles, I decided to try using a new material. I found these tray things at a dollar store and decided to take a shot at making shingles out of them. The idea would be to create long strips of this so I could apply them in strips rather than as individuals. But since this was going to be something that was falling apart, I decided to just do the individual shingles. The roof wasn't that big anyway. As there was no hope that these things wouldn't just melt using hot glue, I went with PVA glue to attach the shingles. As usual, I applied them in an alternating and overlapping pattern, making sure they didn't line up too perfectly. My first problem came when I hit the second row. This material doesn't bend very much, so when I did the overlap of the previous layer, it actually ended up being that the shingles were touching on two very thin edges rather than any full area. The second problem was that this wasn't really a three-sided roof. It was actually six-sided because the substructure main beams were so wide. I kind of had to do a very odd overlapping pattern on just them. Initially, I was pretty impressed with this, especially the overhang edges where there was the most contact. It was fairly rigid. Not wanting to risk this thing falling apart once I started painting, I decided to spray it with this mixture of PVA glue and water. Problem was, the surface of the shingles, which was the area where you eat the food off of, was super duper hydrophobic, and this mixture just sloughed right off. I hoped that straight PVA glue would work a little bit better, so I applied that all over the roof with a brush. Even with this disaster of the roof, this piece was looking a little bit too nice, so I did my usual of hacking away little bits here and there to make it more weathered. Since the dangerous nature of adventuring means that the people who do it usually aren't the most privileged in the society, I figured this wasn't a civic structure that a lot of time and effort went into maintaining. I was pleasantly surprised at how stable this piece was on its own, though the bottoms of the poles were just a little bit uneven. I used a craft file to smooth them out a little bit, though you could use sandpaper or an emery board or something like that. Thinking I was out of the woods, I moved on to giving everything a base coat of Mod Podge mixed with black craft paint. I hoped that the stickier nature of the Mod Podge meant that this would avoid any of the problems I had with the first bit of glue. But I had barely started applying it to the roof when shingles started to fall off. At this point, I started glooping the Mod Podge on much heavier on the roof, hoping again that it would seep in and really bind the whole shingle mess to itself. But again, I had the same problem with the other glue. The hydrophobic nature of the eating surface meant that the Mod Podge was just kind of starting to ball up. At this point, I thought the best way to hold everything together was to create a metal roof cap, something that I could just dig in with some hot glue. I cut a small circle out of food packaging and made a small slit, kind of a Pac-Man mouth looking thing. This way I could fold it over on itself to create a slight conic shape. No measurements, I just eyeballed this. Be careful if you decide to do what I do here and use hot glue to hold this bit together. The thin food packaging cardstock does not insulate against heat very well, and you could burn yourself. Since most of these fallen shingles would be hidden by the cap, I went ahead and applied hot glue to hold them in place, and then just drizzled a whole bunch of hot glue inside the roof cap itself and mushed it on so that everything would stick together. After this, I switched over to surface primer. This was both because of the problems I was having getting anything to stick to the styrofoam and because I wanted to use a smaller brush to get in between the cracks and get to the substructure. I went with a real basic aged wood recipe for most of this. For dry brushing, I had to switch over from the styrofoam surface to something cardboard. Since the whole point of dry brushing is to get most of the moisture out, you really need something that is absorbent. Styrofoam, especially this styrofoam, is definitely not. Once the highlight was done, the only thing left to base coat was the roof cap itself. You could probably do this in bronze or do what I did and use copper. Just make sure that you don't get any on the shingles themselves when you're painting the edges. For the washes, I decided to try something. I went with brown for the shingles and black for everything else. I thought that might be enough of a difference to still make this feel like a cheap, underfunded sort of structure. An interesting idea in theory, but the brown wash was just way too subtle, and this whole thing needed a pop of color. I mixed up a small batch of the wash using brown and green ink. This was applied to all of the shingles, taking special care to not get any on the substructure that was poking through. I was super happy with the way this turned out, but it was so much darker than the rest of it now, I gave the regular wood another coat of the black wash. Now for the most exotic material, a sheet of printer paper. A notice board without notices is just a very crappy gazebo. I cut some small strips and crumpled them up to try to give the paper some texture. This strip was cut into squares of various sizes, remembering that there's no printer or standardized size here. I ripped the edges of a couple of them to make them look like destroyed notices, and this actually worked out super good. If I were to do this again, I would have actually ripped all of the edges because it just looked so much better. For the various scrawlings on the notices, I used a very fine brush and miniature paints. This is honestly much easier than you might think. Obviously, I'm not actually writing anything. I'm just doing squiggly lines. But some of these pieces were so small that I actually had to hold them in place with not my fingers so that I could actually reach the paper. This is great practice for freehand for miniatures because if you don't do a good job, it's fine. Maybe whoever wrote this notice has bad handwriting too. There's all kinds of ways that you can weather paper to make it look more like parchment, so I tried a couple different ones. I had some tea here. I did some dark wash of my brown and then mixed up an even darker brown wash just for this purpose. I did several test pieces with 1 coat of tea, 2 coats of tea, the homemade brown wash, and then the new darker brown wash. In the end, I decided that my favorite was all of them. I did a few of the pieces in each type of wash, though I did make sure that the torn up ones were done in a darker color since I imagine they'd been there longer. Just make sure you don't sneeze while you're letting these dry. If this kind of fine work is too stressful, another option would be to use a super fine permanent marker. I have this 0.05 millimeter tip that I often use for painting the pupils on miniatures, and you can just pump out really fine line work like it's nothing. The wood and the shingles all got a dry brush of a suede as a final highlight, and the roof cap got a highlight using a light copper miniature paint. Something I would recommend when deciding where to put the posters is to pre-organize the piles into which side they're going to go on. You kind of don't want to just start sticking these on willy-nilly and then realize that all the interesting ones are on one side, or you've run out of space and you'd have to hide any of the cool details or gouges you've carved in with the ones that are left. These were applied just with brush on tacky glue, and then a little bit here and there on the edges to make sure they really stuck down. If ever there was a piece of terrain that needs some griming up, it is this. I used a mixture of browns and greens, of course, anywhere where water and mildew would be building up, which is pretty much everywhere, and even some on the edges of a poster or two. I took a red-brown flesh wash and actually used my brush to just flick little specks of it. I'm not going to be able to capture any of this on film, but it is a really fine effect that looks kind of like dried blood. As usual, everything got a coat of a matte varnish to seal everything in, especially all of those posters. And voila, a notice board with lots of crazy posters. To be honest, this is something of a vanity piece. There's not a lot of practical use for this on the play table. This doesn't lead to any dungeons. The posters don't actually correspond to any quests. You're certainly not going to recreate them every time they complete one of them. But what this does do is add a smaller element to the tabletop terrain. If all you've got are big buildings and massive set pieces, it's going to feel like your miniatures are just little toys hanging out amongst the bigger toys. It can be nice to have your players feel dwarfed by a boss battle stadium or a royal throne room or something like that, but creating that kind of personal small scale thing is just as important to making the game feel alive. Assuming you're not one of the people either wanted or missing on these posters, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, let me know in the comments below, and any ideas you have as to ways I could use up those styrofoam plates, because I got 29 of them left and no idea what to do. If you found this particularly useful, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. That really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.